Hola a todos. Estoy muy contenta de decir buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches a todos. Como les decía antes, creo que tenemos a personas de al menos 3 continentes. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Mi nombre es Daniela Sandoval y soy la oficial de Ciencia e Innovación en la Embajada Británica en Santiago, Chile. Solo quería decirles bienvenidos a este evento conjunto entre nuestra embajada y el Ministerio de Ciencia de Chile, enfocado en la importancia de la ciencia. Vamos a escuchar también a nuestra embajadora en Chile, Louise de Sousa, que va a darnos las palabras de bienvenida al evento, junto con el evento Q. Ellos están juntos en Punta Arenas como parte de nuestra estrecha relación. Entonces, embajadora, la palabra es suya. ¿Estoy saliendo? Sí, está saliendo. Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias Daniela, gracias al ministro Q, al profesor Carl Mondales, señores Seremi, doctora Olga Barbosa, profesor Krishna Allen, Gavin Costigan, Leonardo Muñoz, distinguidos profesores, funcionarios públicos, amigos, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros hoy. Estoy encantada de estar con ustedes el día de hoy en este evento que marca no solo el lanzamiento de lo que estamos haciendo, que quiere resumir 17 años de experiencia en este tema del Reino Unido, sino que también celebrar este compromiso compartido que tenemos en ciencias y en políticas públicas en el Reino Unido y en Chile, con el compromiso que tenemos. Nosotros hemos sido partners por mucho tiempo, compartimos valores, pero también compromisos, objetivos, y hemos enfrentado grandes problemas en el último tiempo, cambio climático y por supuesto la pandemia del COVID-19. Sin embargo, es en esta época que la ciencia se ha probado como un gran aliado para poder tomar mejores y más rápidas decisiones. Y esta vez esto ha sido realmente probado en el último tiempo. Hoy vamos a hablar acerca de cómo el Reino Unido ha creado sistemas que describe también lo que hemos aprendido en el último tiempo y cómo nuestro ecosistema se ha tenido que adaptar a un modelo que asegure que tenemos un impacto real en las políticas públicas y también en la prosperidad por consecuencia. Pero tenemos mucho trabajo que hacer aquí y es absolutamente esencial que lleguemos a nuestro objetivo y que nos involucremos en una colaboración internacional. Prueba de esto es que las dos crisis que he mencionado y que estamos enfrentando hoy son crisis globales y no podemos resolver estos problemas solos, tenemos que trabajar juntos. La ciencia nos ha mostrado que es muy importante y los esfuerzos individuales no son suficientes, así que tenemos que aprender los unos de los otros y poder avanzar juntos hacia un futuro más inclusivo y más sustentable, donde la ciencia tiene un rol fundamental. Este reporte es el resultado de un proceso muy largo que fue inspirado por la profesora Karen Mondale, que va a hablarnos hoy, que visitó Chile 2 años atrás en el Congreso Futuro. Fue la COP26, la COP25 para Chile, donde se iba a hablar acerca de las políticas públicas que sellarían esta colaboración. Como resultado del reporte, está hecho para responder las preguntas que tienen que ver con cómo desarrollamos nuestros sistemas y cómo tenemos un recurso que sea útil para todo el resto de los países, que sea interesante y que sea útil también. Me gustaría responder todas las preguntas del reporte. Queremos hablar acerca de nombre y tecnología. Vamos.
Science and Technology, who will be presenting the report afterwards. And I'd like to thank our Science and Innovation Network and, of course, Minister Kuv and Leonardo Muñoz for your inputs and collaboration. We hope this is only the beginning of a long-lasting collaboration on promoting evidence-based policy-making systems. And at this moment, this is the proof. It exists. Minister, your report.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the discussion and that it inspires more of this sort of collaboration in more parts around the world. Thank you very much. Silence, Daniela.
Daniela, are you going to go or should we go?
I thought, yeah, you can go, Minister. Sorry.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Quisiera primero saludarlos.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you all for accompanying us here today. I want to welcome you from Punta Arenas. This is the entry gate to an Antarctic continent that is dedicated to peace and to investigation, and where we see together the present and the future of scientific transformation. From here, from Chile, with the ambassador. As she said, this is a very concrete sample of the collaboration. We have had an intense agenda of visits, of activities here in the region. And I think that this is a clear sample of how a collaboration that has been going on for years can be consolidated and projected into the future. I also wanted to thank Carol Mondell. She is the director of Co-Science, and the distinguished panelists that are going to be here today with us. And the first thing that I would like to do is to thank the work in the elaboration of this report, and also thank you and congratulate you for the very comprehensive report that you have given us today. I had the opportunity to read, not this version in a definite and official format, but I had the opportunity to read the drafts, and this is really an exceptional work. The report is also a report that is very big. So we know that the system is broad, and it is also as the report is, and it covers many areas. It reflects the maturity and the history that we have in the scientific advance system in the United Kingdom, and from where we draw a lot of information. In Chile, we know that we are in a different stage. We are just starting with the installation of a new institutionality, apart from a young nation that just now incorporates the scientific evidence, the scientific community to the decision-making process. In the little bit more than 200 years of Republican history that Chile has, we didn't have a Secretariat of State that installed science at the core of the government. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to participate in the Congress, promoting a constitutional reform about the rights, but that in the broadest aspect also incorporates science and the benefits of science for the well-being of people in our constitution and in our Magna Carta. So we are in a different stage. We are in an initial state. But we have an ecosystem that is centered on innovation, that has been uncoupled from the decision-making. We incorporated the decisions in the high sphere of the policy state, but we have not had this historical aspect to it. We have worked from scientific investigation and from the scientific report, from the scientific publication, and we have put less attention to the demands of the evidence that is needed for the public policy that policymaking needs and that the government needs. Clearly, the consolidation of a science ministry, for this to happen, for this to be linked to public to scientific investigation and policy making, it is necessary. We need to have this link. So that is why we needed a Ministry of Science to include science in the decision-making process. But the Ministry of Science is just not enough. It is not enough to incorporate in an effective way the scientific evidence to the decision-making process. And it is here where report is very valuable to advance in a decisive way in the design and the committees that are established and in the different parts of the government that are going to be involved and benefited from the scientific consulting. So we have advanced towards this direction. We have advanced with the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the Environment, and also with the Ministry of Agriculture. And of course, the pandemic boosted us to create consulting committees for the Ministry of Health and work as well with things such as diagnosis, PCR, genomics, vaccines, etc. The objective of incorporating scientific consultancy is to anticipate and to contribute to looking further from contingency, which is very difficult to do. In politics, the day after day is what consumes most of your energy. So scientific consultancy allows us to go further, to look into the future. So incorporating science as a public policy is something that is going to help us and that is going to help us see further. And it's also going to be good to prioritize, which is something that we cannot do without that, and work on the design and the execution of public policies, but also in reacting in emergencies. So this is a challenge in itself, and it's a totally different challenge in its nature. One thing is policies and scientific researching and policy making, and the other thing is emergencies and science. So we need different deadlines, we need a different articulation method. So that is also contained in the report, and with the mutual learnings that we have had, I think that we are going to be able to advance towards that direction. So this reaction is different, and it's dynamic, it's difficult. In the policy making report, they said that policy making is messy, and it is true, it is messy. Having been in the government, you can say for sure that these are complex and difficult projects, but the truth is the technical word for that is messy. They are messy. So that is why this alliance with the United Kingdom is going to be very important for the future and for the present of the relationship of both countries. So thank you very much. And I want to thank you from here, from Punta Arenas, and wish you a fruitful day. Thank you very much.
So moving right along, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to one of the authors of this famous report we are launching today, Science Advice in the UK. Mr. Gavin Costigan has an extensive experience in national and international science and higher education policy and delivery roles, and it is an expert in developing links between policymakers and academia. He was head of the International Science and Innovation Unit at former BIS and head of Science and Innovation Group in the former FCO, and first head of professions for scientists and engineers in the government. He was also director of the Vice Chancellor Office and director of public policy at the University of Southampton, one of the founders of the university's policy engagement network, UPenn, and currently serves as the chief executive of the Foundation for Science and Technology. Mr. Gavin Costigan, everyone.
Daniela, un segundo antes de continuar con la presentación.
Daniela, before starting with the presentations, here with the ambassador, we need to fly, literally. We need to go to the airport right now. So I wouldn't want to leave you without saying goodbye, both of us. So
sharply, and I hope the rest of the event goes really well. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
So shall I start, Danny?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to present the report which we are launching today, Science Advice in the UK. I want to start by thanking the British Embassy in Santiago and the Ministry for Science in Chile, who've supported this project right from the start. Many individuals in the UK have given their time to be interviewed for this report or to provide written comments, and we're extremely grateful to them. And as was mentioned by the ambassador, the report itself is a collaboration between 4 different authors, and I'm speaking today very much on behalf of all 4 of us. So we're looking in the report at science advice in the UK, but it's not just a description of where we are now. It's very much how we got there. And one of the things that's clear is that the system has evolved over time, both incrementally and sometimes by large steps, and that often follows a crisis where the science advisory system is really tested. And the report looks at different players in this system: government and parliament, research funders and universities. What's clear is that this is very much a journey in terms of science advice, and the UK is some way down that journey, but it's certainly not got a perfect system. Things are still developing, and there's still a way to go as that journey goes forward. So in the report, you'll see this diagram, and I do apologize, it's a little bit small on the screen, which is a good reason to download the report, of course, and to have a look at it in more detail. But what we've attempted to do is to show the flow of science advice. And this moves from left to right, and it comes all the way through different government departments to the Prime Minister. I should say that on the right-hand side, there's also the Cabinet Office. That's a rather strangely titled government department in the UK that's overseen directly by the Prime Minister, that's responsible for a whole lot of coordination of activities across government. And this diagram only shows the national government structures. And I'll talk a little bit later about how people and organisations outside of government feed into this diagram. But right in the centre of the diagram, you see the Government Office for Science and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. They there feed into the Cabinet Office, feed into the Prime Minister. You also have different government departments, of course, and they feed advice both directly, and also there's some coordination. They feed advice through to the Government Office for Science. On the left-hand side of the diagram, you can see that many government departments are supported by scientific advisory committees. And centrally in government, there are some scientific advisory committees. And we're going to talk a little bit later about SAGE, the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies. Whoops, I moved on to. So let me talk a little bit about this role, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. So the first person to be appointed in this role was appointed way back in 1965, although there have been before that people who were responsible for giving advice to government. It's very important to know that this role is not a political appointment. This is a politically neutral role. It's held by a civil servant who would stay in government even if the different government parties changed. This person would typically be a leading scientist or leading researcher in their field. And the authority of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor comes from the Prime Minister. And we spoke to some previous holders of this role, and they emphasized the importance of having that authority directly from the Prime Minister, because that allows them to work across government and to seek support from officials and from ministers in any different government department. Now, because all this is held with one person, trust is a really important part of making all of this work, as are some of the individual relationships between certain key people. And if you think about it, this funneling of things through to one central figure, it can be a real strength. In particular, it allows this trust that I was mentioning to build up between ministers and between officials and between the government chief scientific advisor. But it's also a potential weakness if of that trust and if those relationships don't work. And another potential weakness is a lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion, and the danger of groupthink. And within the UK system, we have other ways of trying to avoid falling into this trap. So the government chief scientific advisor is supported by the Government Office for Science, known as GoScience. It's a central body within the UK government which pulls together scientific advice. And it's true to say in the UK, like everywhere else, the use of scientific advice it requires a cultural shift within the civil service, and GoScience is very much at the heart of trying to make that cultural shift happen and to embed that culture of using science within government. GoScience also has some specific roles to commission certain things. So it does a lot of work on foresight and futures planning, for example. Now, as in every country in the world, individual policy responsibilities are held in different government departments. They all have their own need for science advice. And as of right now, pretty much every government department has a departmental chief scientific advisor. But that was not always the case. One of the crises that happened in the past that showed the need for this was the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001. And there was a recommendation to put more chief scientific advisors in government departments. And it took several years to do that. And departmental CSAs provide advice to their own ministers. They are line managed within their own departments, but they also network with each other, and they also collaborate and push advice where appropriate through to the centre. As with the government chief scientific advisor, they are politically neutral, they're civil servants, they're appointed usually because they are experienced researchers and experts in their field, and quite often they work part-time in government and part-time back in their own university. And as with the government chief scientific advisor, a lot of this is about individual relationships. And it's interesting that the power and the influence that departmental chief scientific advisors have within departments does vary a little bit. And that reflects the cultural shift I was talking about and the fact that some departments have embraced the need for science advice a little bit more than others. And the UK is very much still on a journey in bringing science advice across all different government departments. Some departments fund their own research, and the network of the CSAs have a key role in shaping that science program. And one of the things that's happened in recent years is the publication of something called Areas of Research Interest, or ARIs. And these ARIs identify to funders and to future researchers where the evidence needs are in government, and it allows those people to start to prepare to try and gather that evidence. And again, different government departments have made a greater or lesser use of these ARIs, and that reflects a little bit the culture within different parts of government. Obviously, departmental chief scientific advisors develop systems and structures for science advice within their own departments, and they build relationships internally, but they also have a crucial role to build relationships externally. And if you are a university professor and you want to engage with a department, that the departmental chief scientific advisor in their office is a very good place to start. A key source of advice for government departments is science advisory committees, and many departments have them, and they have slightly different structures and slightly different ways of working, but they tend to either focus on a specific research area or a specific policy area and feed through advice to the government department, explaining the latest state of science. And there's a whole chapter on these science advisory committees in the report. And I mentioned at the start that there are also some central committees, and clearly one of the backdrops to this whole report and the piece of work we've done is the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have a central advisory committee in the UK called SAGE, the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies. And the SAGE model existed before COVID. It emerged from previous emergencies and crises that we'd had, from BSE, from foot and mouth, and from flooding incidents in the UK and so on. But it's become absolutely crucial to the UK during the COVID pandemic. And of course, you can't bring all advice together. So there are a number of subgroups to SAGE, and there are a number of different people feeding in to the system. SAGE was originally designed before COVID in a different way, because generally speaking, a crisis would last a week or it would last 2 weeks. It wasn't supposed to last 2 years. And so there's been a huge expansion in what SAGE does, the way it works, and the way that it's supported through the Government Office for Science. But it is true that the fact that SAGE existed before, that there was a baseline on which a new expanded SAGE could build, was really, really vital so that the UK could start to deal with COVID. Now, of course, COVID has been a big challenge. And of course, not everything has gone perfectly well. It's never going to be easy. There have been some lessons learned. Some of these are shown on this slide. There is, and there can be, a challenging relationship between ministers and science advisors. There can be difficulties in engaging with the science advice. That there is a difficulty of getting the different balance of expertise for tackling something as complicated of COVID. And there are, of course, challenges in communication. But I have to say, despite all of these challenges, it would have been much, much harder for the UK to deal and tackle with COVID if it did not already have science advisory structures in place before COVID struck. I want to talk briefly about Parliament. There's a chapter about Parliament in the report. And as with government, there are challenges in getting successful engagement between parliamentarians and those who have evidence, such as academics. And of course, Parliament has the disadvantage of not having the civil service available to provide advice to it. And a key role is played in Parliament by the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. This acts effectively as Parliament's in-house science advisory mechanism. It promotes links between researchers and Parliament. It produces briefings, it holds events, it delivers training, and it organises fellowships, a whole range of different activities. And similar to government, these have evolved over time. They're not perfect now, but they are better and improved from where they were 15 years ago. Parliamentarians also have a need to draw on very quick scientific advice if they are providing a response to their constituents, if they are taking part in a debate within government. And the libraries within the two chambers of our Parliament provide very quick responses to questions. There is a real challenge, of course, because those responses need to be very fast. And we don't necessarily have a system set up where leading academics can be telephoned at the drop of a hat and provide an instant answer. So there are challenges there, but the libraries actually do an amazing job with what they have. The main part of Parliament that sort of scrutinises the work of government and provides challenge is through the select committee system. They hold inquiries on relevant subjects, and they can call all sorts of people in, and they do solicit specifically scientific evidence and scientific expertise. But they've had in the past the danger of always going to the same experts, to the people they know. And they know about this, and they've taken active steps in the last few years to broaden the diversity of that expertise. And that's been helped in part by increasing incentives for academics to actually take part in policy engagement activities. So here's another diagram that appears in the report. The last one was about the flow of science advice. This one is about the flow of money, and this is money that funds academic research in the UK. A certain amount gets funded through the lower track from right to left, through different government departments straight out into the academic community. But a large amount of scientific research in the UK flows through the upper track through to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and then into UK Research and Innovation, or UKRI. And UKRI has a number of different research councils, and they fund a lot of the academic research in the UK. And this puts UKRI and the research councils in a crucial position. They're able to incentivize the supply of science advice because they have funding that they can push in the direction of academics. So looking a little bit at the role of funders, UKRI and the research councils play a kind of bridging role in between government and the research community. The biggest change in the last few years has been the 7-yearly research excellence framework, which traditionally assesses the quality of the research in UK universities and then provides some funding as a result of that. Since 2014, it's also assessed the quality of the impact of the research, not just the quality of the research. And in the last exercise in 2021, 25% of the money was given on the basis of the quality of the impact of the research. And that impact, of course, includes policy impact. So that's a specific driver for universities to actually do policy impact activities. And there are others as well. You know, the research councils are giving specific funding streams for certain types of policy related activity, targeting long-term evidence needs that the government have, which in some cases come out of those areas of research interest. In some cases, excuse me, the research councils are building their own research and evidence centres. And in some cases, they're building their own groups of evidence brokers to try and make relationships between researchers and government. And ultimately, if people think that this relationship between the research community and the government is important, then there needs to be some shared goals. And part of getting those shared goals is money, and that money feeds through to universities. And universities, of course, are the place where a lot of the scientific evidence and a lot of the scientific expertise resides. So let's look at universities for a moment. There've always been academics who have worked with policymakers, but I have to say this has almost been by accident in years gone by. And in the same way that in the last 10 or 15 years, the UK government has really looked to become more systematic in the way that it uses evidence, universities in the same period have looked to become more systematic in the way that they gather together and provide that evidence to government. And that trend has been driven in part by the financial incentives that I was just mentioning. But many universities have, over the last 10 years, developed specialist policy units, which again act as evidence brokers, bringing together research expertise with people who might need it. But I have to say, this is not easy. And as of now, there are still many more incentives for academics not to engage with policy than there are to engage with policy. There are cultural and practical barriers that limit what's achievable. Things are changing in the UK. This is very much a journey, but all I would say is there's definitely some way to go. So let me draw a few conclusions from what I've been saying, a few take-home messages, if you like. The first one is that the UK science advisory system has evolved over time, and it will continue to evolve. Changes have often followed crises, and the COVID-19 pandemic has already changed the way that the UK does science advice. But as that crisis diminishes and we start to learn the lessons from it, it will no doubt change that system further. In the UK system, the role of the government chief scientific advisor is really crucial, and trust is therefore really important to making that role work. Individual departments, of course, have their own scientific advisors, and there's some level of central coordination across that group. In Parliament, they've taken steps to ensure that parliamentarians can access evidence and advice, and they've really tried hard to make sure it doesn't just come from the usual suspects. Funding agencies and national academies are taking on the role of evidence brokers, and universities are really responding to this. They're beginning to change, particularly in the light of new financial incentives. So that's it. That's a very brief summary of the report. I do encourage you to read the report. As the Minister said, it's very long, so there is quite a lot of detail and quite a lot of information in there. So please do download it, and we'd very much welcome any comments. So if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, please do, and those are my details. And with that, Danny, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Gavin, for that wonderful presentation. Just to note that link is the English version, but then in our website we will have both in English and in Spanish. Our next speaker doesn't need much introduction. So she's our current Chief International Science Envoy at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, our previous Chief Scientific Advisor, and the next UK Science Council President. In her spare time, Professor Mundell is a professor of extragalactic astronomy at the University of Bath, where she holds the Hiroko Sherwin Chair in Extragalactic Astronomy and a fellow of the Institute of Physics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carl Mundell, who will be chairing the panel that we will have now. Thank you.
Daniela, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to join you here today. And I think it's wonderful to hear Gavin's summary of the report, which again, I commend to you all, and also to hear, our ambassador and the minister just describing the very close and warm relationship between the UK and Chile. And, it was my great privilege to visit Chile a couple of years ago, my first time there. And, I was really impressed by the passion for science that ordinary people had, the Futures Congress, and how that created that engagement. And I was also really pleased to bring a delegation of 40 leading scientists and thinkers from the UK to that Congress. So our relationship and our friendship is long and warm, and it's wonderful to be able to share our thinking and our learning, particularly through this extremely difficult pandemic crisis, which I know we're all struggling with. We continue to have the impacts of both, at government, at national, international, and also at very personal level in different ways, how it's affected us differently in our family lives. And so just thank you to Gavin for giving that really comprehensive summary. And as Gavin said, it's still a dynamic system. We continue to learn, and every new challenge will help us to learn more. It's a particular pleasure, I think, to be continuing our work with Chile to help them to create the kind of systems that will work for their nation. And I think that, we have a very eminent panel with us today. I have sat on stage for the COVID crisis early on in January when we first heard the news of this novel coronavirus emerging from Wuhan. We scrambled the SAGE mechanism quickly and started to bring the right kinds of experts into the room, a very interdisciplinary and broad-reaching set of scientists, practitioners, and that again has evolved through the years. So in some ways it was the hardest work I've ever done in my career as a physicist by background, but also some of the most inspiring and humbling to see the work that our scientists and our researchers and our innovators around the world are doing, and that personal connection where you put experts together and they can actually share their thinking. We also did a number of really exciting things, I think, which again will be kept for the future in terms of driving open science. So the research publication sector, so the places where our peer-reviewed science gets published, and it's the right challenge to the scientific method. We worked with journal publishers to make sure that they could speed up that process so that that knowledge was accessible to the whole world as quickly as possible, given the severity of the pandemic that we were dealing with. And so for the panel discussion today, I have 4 eminent speakers, and I'd like to introduce each of them to you and give you a sense of their background, deep and broad and incredibly diverse. And then I'll come to each one of them individually and ask for their reflections and their input, and then we'll draw this discussion more broadly. If you do have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. You can see down at the bottom of the screen, and we will gather up those questions and I will feed them to the appropriate panelists. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting and stimulating discussion. Our 4 speakers will cover both from the UK perspective, the Chilean perspective, and out into the international perspective. Because I think if we've learned anything from this pandemic, is that we're not safe until everyone is safe, and we must help one another to build these capacities for the future in each of our countries, so that we do not have to go through the kind of crisis globally that we've been through in this pandemic, which of course is not yet over, but building up those capacities and sharing best practice will help us to be resilient in the future. So it's my very great pleasure to describe our first speaker, Dr. Olga Barbosa Prieto. She is the Regional Secretary of the Chilean Ministry of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation, which is already a wonderful title in its own right. She's an eminent scientist in her own right as well. She has a PhD in ecology. She is an associate professor at the Austral University in Chile, and she's the former president of the Ecological Society of Chile. She's currently serving as the first regional secretary of the Chilean Ministry of Science, as I've described, and her research focuses very aptly on the relationship between the ecosystem, ecology and biological conservation. And in recent years, in particular, she's been studying ecosystems that are highly disrupted and dominated by human activity, such as urban and agricultural ecosystems. And it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, Olga. And I'm going to come to you when I've introduced the other 3 speakers, because I really want to draw out your expertise and how that brings everything together. What I'd really like to get from you is the Chilean perspective and how you view the UK system and how we can bring those forward. Our second speaker is Dr. Stuart Wainwright. He's the Director for the Government Office for Science and Technology. Stuart became the Director of the Government Office for Science and Technology in September 2019. He's a long-standing civil servant. He was previously the Deputy Director of the International Resilience in the Cabinet Office, and so he's been tested for his current role aptly. Prior to that, he was the DEFRA's the Deputy Director of the Chief Scientific Advisors, and this is very much the food, farming and rural affairs. So again, that connection with our rural ecosystem. And also he supported the Chief Scientific Advisor Network during emergencies. So again, good background training for the SAGE crisis. He's also been an Assistant Director in the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, so really working at the forefront of emergency response. Stuart has a PhD in microbiology, through which he studied the human pathogen Helicobacter, and he has a degree in genetics. So again, the foresight in your original education, Stuart, preparing you for the future that you could not possibly have imagined, but we're glad that you have that expertise. And again, Stuart, I'll come to you and ask you to think about how we internationalise the Go Science experience, and I'll draw a little bit more about your experience of being actually in charge of Go Science and really being there at the coalface. Our third speaker is Christiane Allen. She is the Associate Director for the Centre of Informed Futures at the University of Auckland. Christiane is a senior policy practitioner turned researcher, so the other way around, with specialisation in both science for policy and policy for science. And I think it's really interesting to think about both sides of the coin. Her research interests include science policy processes in small research systems, often where we get the real innovation, and particularly how policy discourses are created and embedded. And again, something that is incredibly hard to do, as we heard from Gavin, and really interesting to hear your sort of research and research practitioner experience there. And she's also an expert in agile policy making processes that can better engage with social and ethical implications, such as new technologies. And again, that's something I'd like to bring out in this conversation, this sense of emerging technologies. We've had an emerging pandemic, but of course this brings to the fore, I think, how we respond in crises that we can yet not foresee. And I think that'll be really important to bring that experience from you. She's also involved with a really interesting international system of government chief scientific advisors. And that's what I would really like to get from her, this sense of internationalising the kind of science advice mechanisms that we'll be talking together today on this bilateral. Because as I say, until we can put that capacity and that resilience in every country, then we will not really be able to genuinely tackle global crises. So Christiane, thank you. And then last but not least, We will bring Mr. Gavin Costigan back onto the stage, as we've heard already, the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Science and Technology, and we heard about his eminent career. And I think what's really interesting about Gavin's experience, and what I'd like to draw from him, is his overview based on his experience starting in the civil service, passing through out into the university system, and the kind of different perspective he had in that ecosystem, and then, you know, going on beyond that into the third sector. So I think bringing those three ecosystems together, because again, you know, we haven't touched much on the third sector, but we have a very strong third sector in the UK, and that works internationally as well. And again, has been, you know, at the forefront of some of our pandemic work, particularly in the low middle income countries, where we've been working together to deal with other kinds of critical illness and disease that maybe have not yet reached pandemic proportion. So let me go back to the top and invite Dr. Olga Barbosa onto the screen. So Olga, as I say, you have this eminent scientific background. You're in government, and now you've been working very closely on the development of this report, and of course operationalizing it into government. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the process so far, and, you know, ask you to reflect a little bit on your perspective on the UK experience, but maybe from the perspective of the impact and some of the hurdles and benefits that you see accruing to Chile, and maybe some of the challenges that might be specific to Chile, and how you think we might help to take these forward. Thank you, Olga. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol. I will speak in English only because if not, I will begin to talk about in Spanish. Yeah. Okay. So here I go. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I read the report and I studied the report. You can see that I really made a mess of it, and I found it very interesting. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody that worked in it, because basically it summarizes, as Gavin said, 70 years of the process. And the things that we see today are things that are relatively recent. So it begins like when people want to do something, and then things become an institution. And I think that process is very important. The other thing that I liked a lot is that, and it has been especially interesting for me, is that now I really understand what's behind many government agencies that I have worked during my period as a scientist. From my postdoc, for example, my postdoc, as you said, I'm an ecologist, was funded by Natural England, the former English Nature. And so I think it's very interesting that an agency was funding, you know, in this case, research that was to understand how, for example, the biodiversity in cities would be, you know, impacted by a public policy that was about making more houses, something that can happen in any country. And recently I've been collaborating with the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which is within DEFRA, another, you know, big institution that you have. And in this case, I am very impressed on how always government agencies seem to be relating all the time with scientists. And I have no doubt that part of my inspiration of working today in the Ministry of Science comes also because of that interaction. So in fact, and the last thing, one of the last things is that I had the pleasure to meet one of the chief scientific advisors, Sir Robert May, and he always attended to many scientific conferences during the period. So I value a lot what Gavin said here also, that this position is not a political position, which is something very important so that we can keep, you know, long-term strategies. So in Chile, the implementation of the Ministry of Science, it's an opportunity, of course, to organize our national ecosystem of science, technology, and knowledge and innovation, and foster coherent, consistent design, implementation, coordination, evaluation, and set some of the policies that we want to put in. The first national policy of science, technology, and knowledge and innovation, for example, it has just appeared, and something that I am especially proud of, the first national policy for gender equality in science, technology, and innovation. and also the policy of artificial intelligence. And what I can say of what I've seen in Chile and what we could, learn from what we have read in this report is that none of the policies would have been developed without a strategic alliance with stakeholders of our national science, technology, and innovation system. And this report shows also that although governments and the development of each country, the issues of each country on the history of each country is something that can be something very different, there is something that is very common of everybody, is that scientists and decision makers relationship can be as messy as we can imagine in UK or in Chile or in everywhere. And this is in part, and I would say I have this book, and it was mentioned, Paul Kaini, in the report, is that basically we as scientists need to learn about the science of policymaking, the first chapter of the book. And we tend to think we have like fantasies of how is to relate with people in the government on how we will deliver the evidence. So I think this is something that is still a challenge everywhere, and that we can, and it is said also in the report. And so it's very different. It's very similar to what we know as this, model, like silos and pipes that use the European Parliament to describe these relationships where basically we have become silos of information, like scientists, institutions or disciplines or anything, and we need these pipes that connect, this information that is in between silos. And I think we will talk about this later, but there is where I find very interesting the figure of the brokers of science and all the system that in general you have in your much more mature system. So in general, I would say that it's very interesting. I recommend to read the report, and I think there are many things that we can learn about and continue collaborating in the development of our own system.
Thank you, Olga. And I think you touch on a really important point that, again, Gavin brought out there, and that's, I think, trust and actually the integrity of the system. And I think when you mention, the AI strategy, I think that for me stands out. I know what you mean about what we see as academics outside when we look into government, and then actually when you arrive in government, and, like Sir Patrick Vallance, I'm a civil servant while I'm in government, and it's a very, very different pace of work. And I've worked with such inspiring individuals, and I know I will take a very different view of the inside of government and the civil service when I go back to academia than I could see from the outside trying to diagnose a system that's opaque from outside. But I think you're right, that translation back and forward and actually helping both sides of the equation to really understand one another's lives, really. I think we all have good intent. We want to build safe, secure, prosperous communities, and actually how we bring those ecosystems together. I think you're also right about in terms of the silos, and it's something that I think we've seen very much in the work of SAGE, something around communication. And just before I move on to our next panelist, if I may, a quick question back to you about, the importance of being able to communicate science, whether that's to the public, whether that's to other experts that are outside of your field, or to politicians or ministers. And I think, in Chile, I see this done very well, like the Futures Congress, for example, and it's a wonderful showcase. Your senators are very closely involved. How did you develop your ability to communicate and move between those silos, which is something that you obviously do very effectively?
Thank you. I think I've learned it through my research, because at the beginning I was working in conservation and in national parks, and where in the magic world of where everything is perfect. And then I realized that nothing was gonna there was gonna not be any changes if all the knowledge was only in papers, because people that take decisions they do not read paper. And I had to say that I learned a lot thanks to some people working at the library of the Congress, of the National Congress in Chile, specifically in the Department of Technical Assessment to parliamentaries, because they have and they have been working with post now, and I think they have a lot of methodologies, and they have helped a lot to me, especially, and other scientists that have had you know, the role of going to different committees in the parliament. So I think both my own experience and meeting this group in the library of the Congress has been very important for me.
That's really interesting, thank you. And that takes me perfectly on to our second speaker, Dr. Stuart Wainwright. And Stuart, I mean, you head up the Office for Government Office for Science. And as I described, you've had a number of really senior civil service and operational roles where you've been working under pressure, where it really matters if you get the answer wrong because you have lives in your hands. And now you manage, you know, a really large number of staff who are broken into smaller divisions, who provide almost a hidden ecosystem of that science advice at different timescales, be that immediate emergency, be that long-term horizon scanning. So it would be really interesting to hear from you, you know, what your day job is like, how you brought those skills together, how GoScience has evolved, and how you see, you know, the opportunities for internationalizing the GoScience model to other countries. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Carol, and well, good afternoon to all my friends in the UK, but good morning to what I hope will become new friends in Chile as well. So Government Office for Science, as Gavin might have outlined earlier, we're quite an interesting part of our government. We sit right in the heart of our government, really with two missions. The first is to provide our Prime Minister and Cabinet with science advice on whatever they need it on. And the second job is to help all of our government get better at using science and technology. So it's a pretty exciting role. Olga, I noticed you described it as having a mature system. I'm sure we do in some ways, but we're always learning. We've learned a lot over the last 18 months, that's for sure. And there's a lot of ways we need to improve. So we're always keen to learn from others. I think something that I always try to keep in mind is when you think about why science matters so much to any government, is very much keeping in mind what a government is for. And I think any government, whatever it is around the world, is trying to make the lives of its citizens better. And I always think there's four ways that a government can do that. The first is to try and bring in new policies to try and make people's lives better. The second is to try and improve the economy, make everyone richer, hopefully. The third is try to improve public services. And the fourth is to protect us all from bad things, whether that's diseases or floods or earthquakes or terrorism or whatever it is. Science matters to all of those fundamentally. If you're going to bring in new policies, you need to understand what your challenges are and whether your policies are going to work. Science matters for that. You're going to improve the economy. So many parts of our economies are technological or rely on innovation, so it matters there. We're going to improve public services. That relies on innovation hugely. And protecting us from bad things. I don't even need to begin to explain that one after the last 18 months that we've had. As Carol said, I've worked as both a policy lead in crisis management in the UK, taking us through Icelandic volcanoes or terrorism or the Salisbury poisonings that we had here a few years ago. But more recently, I've been running the SAGE mechanism, providing the science for government. The two go hand in hand. Whenever a government, any government, is facing a crisis, it needs to be able to do three things. It wants to know what is happening and what is going to happen. It wants to be able to know what it should do, and it wants to know what it should say. Now, science in a lot of situations, and the pandemic's taking this off the scale, is everything that a government needs to do those three things. In the early stages, I'm sure it's the same in both our countries, the only people who had any sense of what was happening and what was going to happen were scientists. The only people who had really any kind of potential solutions were scientists. And the only people who could talk of any kind of confidence to the public were scientists. So it was pretty fundamental to the whole of the national and indeed the international response to get that right. But right now in the UK government, I joined Go Science just before the pandemic started. I came here to have a quiet life. I didn't quite happy. And even before the pandemic hit, the UK government had realised they wanted more from science than ever before. We'd been burnt a bit by not being that ready for 5G. We could see all the scientific challenges around net zero. But then the pandemic's taken it to a whole new level. And in the UK government, it's a wonderful time to be here. That suddenly politicians want science in everything. They want our advice. They want to fund it. Just yesterday, the UN, our Prime Minister, said, listen to the scientists on climate change. I don't recall that happening before. It's quite phenomenal. So it's a good time to be here. But we've learned our system has evolved and adapted through a lot of hard times over the years, and it still needs to. There's things that we're looking to evolve and grow on the back of the pandemic. There's things that we didn't get right. There's new things that we did that we'd never done before that were great. We want to do more of them. So we need to keep learning and evolving. Just this morning, we had a session with our Japanese colleagues, like we're having with you. Seem to have a lot in common with the Japanese. I think it's something to do with both living on islands off the ends of large continents. I don't know. But you can always learn from other nations. Every system is a little different. There's always commonalities. There's always sharing that can go on. There's always exchanges that can be made. And we're all enriched through that sharing, which is why the report that Gavin and the team have done is so important in helping others as well. But we are keen to learn because there's ways that we need to improve as well. So I hope through this session today, we carry on the relationship a bit longer, but we can deepen it even more. We can share more, we can learn more together. We can exchange more.
Stuart, thank you. That was fantastic, very inspiring. You know, I have a couple of sort of challenging questions back to you because, you know, having lived through this, the two of us working at the heart of this, one of the things that really struck me about learning on the job was about how we publish as government. And again, it goes back to the trust question. You know, the media, we have a free media, rightly so. They challenge. It's a very fast moving 24/7 kind of media coverage. And of course, you know, making sure that when government speaks, actually there are other people speaking. We have the Science Media Centre. We have our scientists who can speak independently. But I guess my question back to you is sort of the learning about that publication of the science advice that government is using and how you put that structure in place, because that's brand new. And I think also, you know, the integrity of that system and ultimately how we protect the resilience of the scientists who are providing that advice to us, because I've seen them work incredibly hard and they've given their time really, you know, for free, and evenings, weekends, you know, they've really mobilized in a warlike focus. But, you know, thinking about I guess also the political side where our scientists are quite prominent, you know, we were very transparent about the names of people on SAGE, and our scientists have had to navigate that as individuals also with their own personal challenges through this pandemic. So maybe some reflections on how as government you've provided that protection and that publication space.
That's a great question, Carol. Gosh, there's a lot to it. I mean, I think it's been one of the strengths that we've had is how the whole scientific community here has lent in to help, whether that's been academics or our national academies. They've all just put aside whatever differences they had and everything else, and worked together. And it's been actually really very inspiring and helped us through it hugely. Just for everyone's benefit, before the pandemic, we had a policy that the minutes of SAGE were not published until after a crisis was done. As Gavin said earlier, crises usually only last 1 to 3 or 4 weeks, and then we publish all the SAGE advice after it. But in this one, obviously, it was going to go on for a long time. And so a few weeks into it, we pushed within our government to get agreement that we should start publishing the SAGE advice as it was produced. And that's what we've ended up doing. That was hard. You guys, you know, colleagues in Chile, government officials as well, there's two things in tension here. You know, the needs of government to think about things in a quiet way behind closed doors and then come out to the public with what it wants to do is in tension with the world of science and academia, which is naturally open and transparent. And an organisation like ours sits right at the heart of that tension, which is hard to manage. So we ended up moving to a place where we published Sage Minutes about a week after the meetings happened. And that has definitely been the right thing to do and a good thing. It's helped the public understanding of the science. I think it's actually in the end helped our government manage the situation a bit better as well. However, it has had some negative consequences. I don't think we or our science academic experts were ready for some of the abuse and the vitriol that some of them receive online, and even the physical abuse that they've received. We knew it might happen, but I don't think we or they were ready psychologically or to deal with that. And then famously, parts of the British press are not very helpful, and they quite often take sage advice out of context and use it to portray a kind of scientist versus politician angle. They like to build it up into a battle. It was such sometimes, but not all the time. So it was the right thing to do, but there were consequences. And we helped our scientific colleagues through giving them comm support, well-being support, counselling support, advice on physical security, internet security, access to our intelligence services for advice, pretty full-on support for them, which they appreciated. But it's one of the things we need to look back and reflect on and learn from this. 24/7 media, social media is only going to increase. And this has been the first major global crisis we faced, I think, since we've had social media. And I don't think we were ready as a system for dealing with that. And I think we have things to learn about how we can ensure transparency in a situation like this and engage our publics in the scientific issues. But equally, manage social media and look after our scientists in that context. And we haven't got the answers to that. I think we've got sticking plasters, but not a proper answer.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I think that's possibly a reflection on wider society as well. But I mean, my observation would be, as you say, it was very welcome, the support that you provided. And I think that gave the scientists the confidence to continue to engage and new experts to come to the table. And I think certainly what has struck me, I think the way Sir Patrick Vallance managed this and managed SAGE was he was very clear about when the science advice ended and when the policy teams should pick up. And the scientists provide the advice. They also provide that advice in a very dynamic way. So what do we know? How well do we know it? How uncertain are we? Why are we uncertain? And what are we doing about pushing the frontiers of knowledge forward? And I think that was a sea change for me as well. And I think what we also managed to do is educate our politicians. It's not a yes or no. And if the answer changes, it's a U-turn and it's a political failure. It's actually we are learning and creating new knowledge, because there was much new knowledge that was created through the research that SAGE experts actually did. For example, in social psychology, you know, people had the intent to self-isolate when they were infected, but did they have the capability to? And seeing that science advice go through to our Treasury to provide the right financial mechanisms to support people and to deliver on our public health objectives, which was to reduce the pandemic, was incredibly inspiring to me. So, you know, I think we've, you know, testament to the support that you've given. I know your team's worked incredibly hard in the background, particularly to get the system set up to publish the government science advice in a uniform template, which I think also made things really efficient. I am going to come back more broadly to everybody about a question about professionalisation of the science policy interface. So I'd like you all to be thinking of that in the background, because I think there's a question about bringing experts in and working with expert policy teams. And again, it goes back to this question around security and resilience, Stuart, or whether we should be professionalising that interface. And I think there are some reflections that we may have from both countries. But now it's my great pleasure to bring in our third speaker, Christiane Allen. And as I say, Christiane has particular expertise in the international space. And so she is part of the international network for government science advice. And these are government science advisors around the world who connect together to support one another and to help one another to provide that international science advice initiative. And this has grown. I know it's been growing. We've had some leaders from the UK, and I think Chile also has membership there. So I'm really interested to hear, Christiane, you know, your perspectives, and as I say, your background particularly because you're at the University the Centre for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland. And I think that informed futures word is a really interesting concept. How do we inform ourselves about the future? Are we informing the future? Are we affecting it? So all of that together in that global context. So very interested to hear your perspectives. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us at a very antisocial hour, I suspect, as well. Trying to get our hours right.
It's a bit antisocial here in New Zealand, despite the fact that I feel like Chile and New Zealand are neighbors, but somehow there's a date line between us. So it's quite early here on Friday morning. But thank you so much for this opportunity to join you for the launch of this truly impressive and invaluable report. And my sincere congratulations to the authors and the sponsors of the report. It certainly is the type of document that I would have found an important resource during my time directing the Office of the Chief Science Advisor here in New Zealand at the time, Sir Peter Gluckman. Which some of you may know, that office was really modeled on the UK system. Although even then, the institutional and constitutional differences in context here in New Zealand were still very strongly felt. And it was perhaps for that lack of original guidance and systemic insight of the type that this report now offers that Sir Peter and I sort of reached out across the globe and launched the International Network for Government Science Advice, which is a global community of researchers and practitioners working at or studying the interfaces between science, quite broadly speaking, and public policy. And since 2014, this network, INGSA as it's known, has grown to over 6,000 members in over 140 countries. And indeed, as was mentioned, we have a new vice president who is Chilean, and we're very pleased to welcome on board Dr. Soledad Quirrijos Valenzuela. But it's through the breadth and diversity of membership of INGSA that I've really come to learn that the structures and relationships between evidence and public policy are dynamic, and they're very contextualized. And this relationship is really the product of place, of culture, of history, and it's responsive to material, institutional, and ideational contexts, and different constitutional arrangements, where the role of science and evidence may be interpreted differently, may be manifested differently, and certainly may be mobilized in quite different ways. But it's also a relationship, as has been already said, that is needed now more than ever. Never before have we seen such a need for global alignment in this regard between science and public policy. The climate emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of certainly the next challenges that will inevitably arise in our interconnected world just don't afford us the luxury of time. We need consensus on evidence. We need consensus on how to apply it. All of this is urgent. But the growing common discourse on science advice nationally and globally is welcome and indeed urgent and necessary. So I guess the question is, how do we get there as a global community? Well, surely this report makes a big contribution to that. But I'd like to seize on something in the introduction of the report, and it's already been noted here a few times, and that is it summarizes no fewer than 70 years of evolution in the science advice ecosystem of the UK. And in policy terms and institutional terms, 70 years is a long time. And it shows that advisory ecosystems, I think, are simply not something that can develop overnight, and least of all in countries where perhaps capacity in the knowledge sector may be variable or still growing, and where knowledge institutions may still be getting established. And certainly in contexts where trust in established processes may be lower, whether that's in government or in the knowledge sector. And unfortunately, we've seen over the course of this crisis that it's those very moments when science advice is most needed that are also the moments when science can be most contested by a fearful and mistrusting public. And so building that trust can come through strong and effective institutions, but that's what takes time. Nonetheless, and thankfully, this report does provide quite a useful template that helps to map out national systems. Different contexts will have different ways of organizing them, but I think the utility of the report is really that one can distill from it some basic components. And these are components that I've certainly seen place to place, working with INSA across different countries, across different national science advisory systems. There are certainly some common components that I think this report draws out nicely. And it starts really with a shared understanding of the role of scientific knowledge in the public arena. And what's interesting here is the very location of the science advisory structure can really signal what this understanding is about and where it's coming from in one country or another. In the UK, for instance, it's nested within the Ministry of Industry, as it is here in New Zealand and the Canadian context too, for instance, but elsewhere it resides within ministries of higher education. In Chile, a fairly new Ministry of Science developed for exactly these reasons, to really provide a nexus of scientific knowledge that can be fed directly into government. So I think that those reporting lines and those structures are actually quite important, and it says something about the place of public science in the government structure. And then next you have the mechanism for advice to the executive. And that needn't be centralized in an individual. It can be a committee, it can be a series of committees, but what's important here is that there's room for both formal and informal advice. There's room for both knowledge brokerage and synthesis. The same goes for advice to the legislature. Although that will depend on the institutional and constitutional settings. So in countries where you have a federated model, you'll see advice to legislatures at provincial or state level, as well as at national levels. And I think these are the institutional settings that really need to be taken into account as we look at what is the ideal recipe, because it does differ from country to country. And then, of course, the report outlines how advice gets fed into and is part of the administration or the bureaucracy, the internal advice. And I really appreciated the emphasis here in the report on this idea of reversing the assumption about outsourcing that capability, and that government really does need that capability internally to become the intelligent customer in many ways, but also to be producing its own knowledge internally. And this too is something that we see embedding in different ways from region to region, from place to place. The report also talks about independent science advice outside of government and coming from national academies. And one of the things we've noted in INSA is that, again, depending on the context of the country and the institutional capacities, it may well be that the National Academy is not as outside as we think it is, because it really does become another sort of advisory arm of government directly. And there's, there are ways of protecting the integrity of science and understanding that the National Academy can serve both purposes. So I think it's important to note that that's not always outside, and that it can well be inside the system and still providing that advice with solid scientific integrity. The report notes the types of committee structures, such as SAGE, such as foresight committees, that anticipatory feature that is also increasingly required in science advisory structures. But I'll just end with two observations that it also makes that I find particularly compelling. And one is the fact that we can really no longer talk about science for policy and policy for science as quite separate and siloed things, nor even simply two sides of the same coin. And that's because, as the report rightly outlines, that over the past decades, research and policy has become so interconnected in very complex ways, because governments increasingly seek to enhance engagement with the science community through universities and public research organizations. And those universities also try to have more influence in policy. And so you see this real interconnectedness and interdependence that is truly quite a massive shift in how the public research community has now operates. And so it still requires a lot of work, I think, in really understanding how best to train and incentivize scientists and how to shift those structures of universities and how we train the next generation. And then the last point that I'll reflect on a little bit is just the fact that we know that that in the past it has been, as has been said here today, events and sort of critical junctures that have stirred action and the creation of new institutions and organizations. And certainly the pandemic has been unprecedented. It's an unprecedented global moment in this regard. And it's certainly an opportunity to seize. So let's hope we, for all of the suffering that we've been through globally, this is an opportunity that we really can't squander now. As we turn to how we can build and grow from it in our science advisory structures. Because the more we can do as a global community, the better, certainly. And learning from each other is important, but so too is global equity in access to knowledge and evidence and scientific skill. And this is equally an urgent area of international cooperation, more important now than ever. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and really insightful comments. And please, forgive me for dropping your professor title. That was remiss of me to do that. I think your comments are incredibly deep and broad-reaching. And what really strikes me, I think, is the sense of the tension in the ecosystem. If you get the tension and the balance right, it will work. But it's something that everybody has to put effort into. So, when does advice become lobbying, or when is it perceived to be such, even if it's not? As you say, we test that system at times of crisis. This crisis was a pandemic, but a country may have a funding crisis, and scientists may lose trust in governments who decide or perceive that they're not funding science adequately. Then maybe the science advice feels from the political perspective that it went wrong, and then politicians don't trust their scientists. So I think it's really interesting what you say about those different kinds of ecosystems and the context being important, but also that sharing internationally so that we can understand the context that drives some of maybe the unintended consequences or the breakdown or the lack of building of trust. I know I've worked with governments around the world where all sides don't trust one another, but through, a third party, maybe me or, my science and innovation team or our embassy, just by engaging, suddenly you start to have a much warmer conversation. And everybody wants to do the right thing, but they're not quite sure of where everybody's coming from. Just one question before I move on to Gavin, because I want to draw all of you into this sort of broader conversation now, because we've got a number of really interesting questions here about how the pieces join together, and when scientists are interfaced with policy, when policy interfaces with politics. So I think there's a running theme there. But what I really liked was this idea of inclusion, and I think Olga, you mentioned this too with your gender and diversity aspect. And I think Christian, you were talking about that global equity, and whether that's local, whether that's national. I mean, both of you have really active and wise Indigenous communities in both of your countries, and that engagement. I know I've seen your government chief scientific advisor, Christian, learn from your Indigenous communities. And I think that's really important as we start to talk about biodiversity and the human nature divide that obviously I know Olga's an expert on, and that climate change, that broader agenda. And do you have reflections on that broader piece of inclusion and bringing different voices to the table? And as Gavin described it, I think, going beyond the usual suspects, because I think that's kind of a perpetual problem, whether that's right down in the scientific lab. I'm a physicist. We have quite a strong monoculture in physics, and it's mostly older white men, with respect, that we're trying to tackle. So I see monocultures in my own personal life and how that manifests right up onto the global scale. So what would your tips be there?
Yeah, your question is really welcome, and it certainly sort of bookends my day, because I started my day on a panel here in New Zealand, which included a Maori scholar and a climate physicist who specializes in the water cycle. And what the climate scientist remarked on, which I think many of us have seen over these past few years, and especially through crisis, is that science is actually catching up to where Indigenous knowledge and indigenous perspectives have long been. And what he meant by that, and what I'm increasingly seeing, is that science is now understood to be not linear, not a straightforward linear process, but certainly an interconnected, interdependent process of many feedbacks and loops and intricate, circles that encircle more and more questions. And so this idea of real complexity science is something that indigenous knowledge has always encapsulated. And I feel like we're just catching up.
Thank you. I know Stuart has to leave, and I want to ping the same question to him before he goes about that policy, politics, science interface. Stuart, any reflections from you before I go to Gavin, who's actually lived the interfaces?
Gosh, that is a big question. We could write a heck of a lot of novels on that, couldn't we? Where to start? It's important to keep that divide, both politics to policy, policy to science. Other thing to keep in mind is that I think it's always important, particularly when you're faced with very challenging situations, whether someone is a politician or a policymaker, a scientist, people generally want to try and do the right thing. But there is tension between those worlds that needs to be managed. So politics, that's a damn hard job for anyone to do, trying to steer decisions of a nation, manage public's perceptions and their view is incredibly hard. And even for policymakers, I think it's really important for them to produce their advice in an honest, impartial way with a great deal of integrity around what they're advising, be clear on the ramifications and the impacts. And then it's for the politicians to make their decision. But when it comes to science advice into the process, we need to be equally as careful there. Make sure when we're constructing science advice that we're clear on what we know, what we don't know, the levels of uncertainty. Sometimes you have to help policymakers ask the right questions of you. But when that advice is given, it has to be clear that it is science advice. And often a policymaker has to mesh together science advice with other forms. It might be economics, it might be operational, whatever it is. Weave all those aspects together to then enable political decision. So really important to be clear on what advice is, the nature, the limitations of it, but having dialogue between those different worlds is so important if people are going to find their way through challenging situations.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. That provenance question is that's come across really clearly. And actually, you've given me a perfect segue into Gavin. Stuart, thank you so much for your time. I know you have to leave us now. Apologies, we've run over. I hope our other panelists can stick with us for a little while because I think the discussion is going incredibly well. I'd like to hand over to Gavin, who's actually navigated those three worlds. So as a civil servant, I mean, we've had, our eminent scientists speak. We now have, a civil servant who's moved into the world of universities and then onto the third sector. So I'm really interested in your reflections. Gavin, over to you, please.
Thanks, Carol. I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that it's a huge culture shock. I worked in the predecessor to the Government Office for Science for many years. I was involved in strategy for funding of university research. I thought that I understood universities. And I moved into a university and I realized I did not understand universities at all. But it was also fairly clear within a very short space of time that the university I worked in did not understand government at all. And lots of silly but actual assumptions that people make about even down to what people actually do during their day and how things happen and the process that policymakers go. And as I was working in the university, I took up the role of Director of Public Policy, and I was actually trying to use some of the money that I was talking about earlier that's coming from the government to actually promote more collaboration between our researchers and our civil servants. And I found that a core part of my time was spent explaining to people in the university how policy worked, what the process was, what people did, how it all shaped together. But then an increasing amount of time was actually spent explaining the same thing in reverse to civil servants. You know, I've got great examples, which I won't share, of bringing together people from both sides in a room and finding that they're talking about the same subject. They're agreeing with each other, but they don't realize they're agreeing with each other, and they think that they're disagreeing with each other. And I've then had to intervene and explain, no, you're just talking the same version of the problem, but from a slightly different perspective. And although it's very strange, I'm monolingual, but I did feel I was translating from English to English on a number of occasions, which is very interesting. I mean, I now work in a charity, and again, there's an awful lot that charities do that the third sector does. And there's a different set of dynamics, again, to the way that what you can do, what you can say, how you want to operate. But the real thing is that people live and work in one culture and don't understand. And so what I'd like to see more of is more people moving and actually working and experiencing these things, but also more people at the boundaries actually having a bit of not a brokering role, because not everybody can move from one place to another. That's you want people to have deep expertise in the civil service, in academia, but you can have people who can broker and be at the center and help those conversations to take place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think it's not for everybody to shift all the time, but people who have the interest and can be enabled to do that. I mean, we had a really specific question. I'm going to come to Olga after I've asked you these two questions, because she has, again, that multi-environment experience, and I'd really like to gather her observations from the Chilean side as well. But, you know, real specific questions. So in your opening presentation, Gavin, you said you reached beyond the same old suspects. And we have a question as to how did you do that? What was that process? And I think that's a deep and perennial question. It's not just the same old suspects, but it's when we do evidence synthesis. I'm often asked as a chief scientific advisor, how do you know you've not missed the thing that matters? There's, you know, there's such a, I mean, the world is full of a huge amount of knowledge and information, and we're creating more all the time. How do we know we haven't missed something? And how do you go beyond? What's a usual suspect and how do you go beyond them, I guess is my question.
So when I was speaking and used those words, I was talking about Parliament rather than government. And Parliament did a number of things to try and make sure that they would do that. So, and some of them are actually quite straightforward. So the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology has a unit within it that is specifically looking to reach out. One of the things they did was to tweet about all new inquiries. But it was the fact that that group was tweeting, and that group within the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology was one that people who were interested in that space would be following. So that's one thing. The same group tour UK universities and try and provide training on how Parliament works, what it's looking for, how to do those different things. But there's also specific financial incentives. So, you know, money is made available for people to come and work in Parliament and do that kind of thing. And finally, you know, Parliament in its select committee process specifically, decided that it was going to make this a priority, and it spent some time reviewing what it did, seeing the fact that it was in a little bit of an area. And I think once you're aware of the fact that you have a problem and that there are some potential incentives to do something about it, you can. And I think in the government in the UK has done the same thing. I mean, those departments that have really embraced areas of research interest and really started to talk about the questions that they'd like to see answered in 3, 4, 5 years' time have started to really engage universities and really go out and talk about their evidence needs and try and bring in different people. And, you know, departments can do simple things. They can hold seminar series and invite speakers in. They can deliberately encourage younger researchers, deliberately encourage things that are targeted. Also, incidentally, they can deliberately encourage mid-career civil servants rather than only senior civil servants to start engaging with some of these things. So part of it is realizing you have a problem. Part of it is having a bit of time and a bit of money and one or two individuals who are tasked with trying to take it forward. But it's not easy. Let's be clear, it's not easy. It's very much an incremental process. Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think I've seen that both as an academic outside and now as a civil servant inside, that increase in transparency and showing the intent that the desire to be transparent is there. It's actually sometimes a resource limit, or you tend to only get information from a particular channel. You don't know what you don't know. So when you start to open up these other opportunities, people can sort of avail themselves, and whether it's funding, whether it's an engagement mechanism. But Olga, I'd like to bring you in and get that sort of Chilean perspective, because you've got, you know, a really strong sort of what I sense as scientists in government, you know, back out into academia. But again, you know, you still have that challenge of world-leading universities. We all have funding limitations. How do you navigate that space? And do you think that we need a professionalization of the science policy interface, so we actually have masters and diplomas in science policy, or do you think that we need to keep the systems clean and find ways to have brokers and movement between the different communities?
That's a great question, Carol. And I have to say first that I am in my first, almost second cultural shock, as Gavin says, because this is my first step. I was in academia and I'm working in the government, and then, well, at the end of this period, I will go back to the academia. So later I can tell you a bit more. But I think it's a great question, because I would love to have a master on what you just said, but I think that first, like in the first hand, there's something very, very, you know, concrete to do. And what I've seen, especially at the university, is that we are not training our students with capabilities to develop in different stages. The Ministry of Science just had, for example, like a funding for the universities, which is called Ciencia 2030, which is trying to put all the capabilities in scientists, in undergrads, so that they can move into the private sector, for example. So we need to make the same, I think we need to make the same, you know, encouragement to work in the government. And in that sense, having 5 secretaries, Seremis like me, that we are, the 5 of us, we are all scientists, and we are working, you know, in different regions, and this macro regions is going to be an interesting experiment. So first of all, you know, we should have teach and train people with capabilities. Second, we need to respect more the different capabilities that people have. When you are in academia, you see that there's people like me that, for example, have some capability to talk and move around different worlds, but there are people that are very capable, or they're very productive, for example, on writing papers, and you don't need to tell them that they need to go out. My message for that is that they need to make that science available in some way and find those ways. But we cannot, you don't want, nobody can be, you know, a superhuman, being able to do everything perfectly well. So we should definitely respect diversity in academia, which is the world that I know more. Then I think also something that Gavin said, and I said, and I read in the report, is that we are in Chile long away on you know, making the system to provide incentives for political, so that in academia you can you know, work in political advice. So if you work, for example, with a parliament, or you are part of a council for the government, you still don't get the recognition from the university, or you just receive like a check. And it doesn't matter if you do little or a lot, but the incentives are not great now. The incentives, as the report says there, are focused on productivity. And that's the way you get another grant. And maybe in your free time,
Yeah, really, really good answer. And as you say, actually thinking about what it is that flows. Is it the knowledge, the insight, the data, the people? You can't mass shift people, but actually you may have a few that help you lubricate the system. I think my observation as well for the chief scientific advisors, they are openly advertised. They're very competitive positions. And actually we obviously sometimes search agencies will help the government to go out and really reach people who normally wouldn't come forward and apply for one of those. So I think that reach into non-traditional areas, goes back to the answer that Gavin gave about not the usual suspects. And again, it feeds back into that diversity, that actually if you see someone who looks like you, then maybe you think there's a chance of a path there. So role models, I think, are incredibly important. And, if I could just end sort of with one final question, I think, to each of you, and I'd like to get a sense of your optimism here. I mean, we've done everything from local communities through different sectors to that international space. Do we see science policy fellows moving from one country to another and sharing this best practice, Christian? What's the thing that excites you most that you think we don't yet have that we could do that would really make a difference? Let me start with Christian and then go to Olga and finish with Gavin. Christian, please.
Thank you. I mean, Olga's last comments really were spot on. I think it's about creating those systems and processes that allow that kind of flow. And what I'm seeing that's so exciting is the cohort coming through, the hunger for those positions and mechanisms coming from the next generation researchers. They're ready to take this on. They know that the conventional academic positions are not what the future holds for them, and they're looking for new challenges. And I think that with the deep expertise that they're bringing, that's the moment where it's time to take the leap into something new. And so INGSA, for instance, I wish we could do more, but INGSA offers a number of fellowship type of programs through our Knowledge Associates program. The INGSA chapters offer some very small funding that really only allows us to show the real appetite that's out there. The funding that we give is for, writing papers, and it's always oversubscribed. So that's, I think, where the future lies, is in next generation researchers and just creating these opportunities, whether internationally or within countries. The other thing I would mention is offices of chief science advisors and and chief science advisory mechanisms, bringing on those paid internships of students or fellows coming through, and being able to mentor them, but also really tapping into the knowledge that they bring, which is just so cutting edge because they're coming straight out of their programs in universities with the freshest knowledge possible.
Yeah, really good idea. And I think also what I've seen from our wonderful interns and fellows, we give them real work to do in Whitehall. And I think that's really important. It's real work at the pace that is needed in government. And they take that back to either their academic studies or their academic positions and then on into industry. As you said, Olga, that's the third pillar there, that it's often the ecosystem. We sometimes experience two. We maybe don't always experience the third. Olga, your optimistic point and what could make a difference?
Well, I'm going to add on Christine's comment, and I will highlight the internships. Definitely, that's something that makes me very optimistic, and I hope that we will soon have that. But something that makes me more optimistic is about our policy for gender equality. Because I would like to see more, chief advisor of science in UK that would be women, for example, or in our system. So we have made a big job on that, on terms of a big diagnostic on what are we missing, where are we missing, and why are we missing women in leadership positions. And I am very excited to see how this policy will spread, into it is a national policy, but it's now developed for science, technology, and innovation. However, science, technology, and innovation is really transversal to everything. Therefore, I am really excited to see how this is going to permeate every other sector, in the way that we really get all the talent that we have and that we are not using and that we are not giving space, and especially in gender, but also that will open also this, what I said at the beginning, like that we get to value diversity. Diversity is very important in all the aspects, so that we can make better policies and that we can make policies that are really good for people, not only for one sector in particular.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's wonderful to hear you say it and actually be in a position to make that change. And I think, many of our audience will be agreeing with that, because I think it's not just women because it's the right thing to do, but actually it's equity and justice for everybody in our communities. And, the conversations that I've been involved in recently, where it's young men who are saying, well, actually, we would like to think about differently how we work within our families. And the COVID crisis has really brought that home to us, that first of all, it's a lot of work to take care of a family. We'd like to take more of a share of that. And we'd like to use actually digital technology to transform the way we work so we can be more effective, more productive, but actually more connected with our families. And so we can get rid of these stereotypes as to who does what. And as you say, leaders of all kinds, all sorts of different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, lived experiences. That's the only way we'll actually get the right answers for society. And Gavin, over to you as now the man left on our panel. So we're not diverse in the other direction. We're not 50-50, but it's quite refreshing, I think, for the women on this call that it's this way round. So no pressure, but give us your optimistic change.
Well, firstly, let me say I agree with everything that Olga and Christiane have said. I'm really optimistic about both of those things as well. But just to pick another example, I'm quite excited about the change that's happening in universities, at least in the UK, about the development of a whole new university profession that is about evidence brokerage. And I don't know where it's going to go, but if I contrast it with where universities were 30 years ago in terms of the way that they worked with industry, and back then, lots of universities thought they needed to work with industry better and not just have individual academics, but units and support. And that whole process has grown. And I've been involved a little bit in what I think is the start of a new trend, the start of a new profession for these evidence brokering teams and organizations in universities. And it's an exciting time to be in that space in the UK at the moment. And it's very uncertain, but I don't think it's a flash in the pan. I think it is going to continue and be somewhere. So as well as agreeing with Olga and Christian, that's my one extra area of excitement. So thank you.
Thank you. That sounds like, so if we solved it already on the panel after all of our discussion. So we've had some wonderful questions in at in the chat. I think we've touched on probably all of them in some way. There are some very specific ones like how do we ensure that ATESA is the same as NICE in the UK, so for clinical excellence, and how do we give them some independence? I think my observation would be there again, we go back to that conversation about trust, integrity, about the provenance of the information that you bring in, about transparency. So I think there's much on this call that will answer some of those questions in the chats. Again, about that new profession, we've answered that. And ultimately also the really big importance of not just thinking about science and technology as the physical sciences and engineering, but we need to bring in the arts, the humanities, social science, psychology, which we did actually for our SAGE response to the coronavirus. And again, the underpinning to all of this is the scientific method. You know, challenge the assumptions, put down a meaningful question, gather the evidence and the data, and do the peer review. So I will give my thanks to our wonderful and eminent panelists. It's been my great privilege and pleasure. I'm sorry, I'm spitting my teeth out now, too much speaking. Privilege and pleasure to host you on this wonderful panel. And I wish Chile all the best with taking forward your constitution change, which I know you're working on that and bringing forward these wonderful initiatives. I know our friendship will continue, and then our multilateral and New Zealand, you know, strong friendships there. And it's wonderful to have you connected on the panel, and I know that together we'll be able to establish these systems and processes, and who knows, maybe we'll start to share international fellows around our different systems. So Daniela, I'll pass back to you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all, and thank you so much, Carol, for this amazing conversation. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Christian. I think you can go back to sleep now. It's like 3 a.m. over there. So thank you so much for your support and commitment. And we hope to keep this conversation going in the future. So as some of our speakers have noted, this initiative was a journey that we started about 2 years ago between our embassy and the Ministry of Science, especially with somebody that I admire deeply, not only for what he does, but also for his vision on how science can impact public policy, which is basically the reason why we are all here. So our last presenter is not only the current advisor to the Chilean minister and part of the Chilean delegation for COP, but also head of the Science and Government Department in the ministry. He has spent 11 years in academia, 15 years in the public sector, providing advice to different public institutions like the Ministry of Agriculture, Economy, and of course, Science. Additionally, he has played leading roles in agencies like Corfo and the National Council of Innovation for Development, CENIT, where he served as Director of Science for Development. Mr. Leonardo Muñoz, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. Firstly, I would like to thank our panelists for this very rich, informative, and inspiring session about the linkages between science advice and the policymaking. We know that the ultimate goal is to develop an evidence-informed policies approach to enhance the impact of policy to address societal and development challenges. Dear Gavin, I do really appreciate the massive amount of work that you have managed to produce this report, and also for your patience to answer the large and very wide set of questions that we have as a Ministry of Science in this initial process of linking science and policy process in our Chilean context. We are at the very beginning of this process. We are just starting, and to learn from the 7 decades of experience is a very, very privilege to have this input in our initial stage. Dear Carol and dear panelists, if you allow me to sum up some learnings, I would like to switch into Spanish since our audience is mainly Spanish speakers. So, en la experiencia que hemos tenido en Chile, principalmente hemos tenido dos hitos.
In the experience that we've had in Chile, we've mainly had two very important milestones. One is the Congress Library, where the technical and parliamentary information and scientific reporting has been very important for us, and advice. And in this report that Gavin generated, elaborated, and with all this alliance that we had with the embassy, it generates a lot of links with the experience with POST. And we, as the Ministry of Science, in this process that we've been consolidating ourselves as a ministerial department, we started a pilot program in this ministry that is trying to look for formal channels that can link science and public policies. And the experience that we've been generating from the first days that we started with the ministry, especially with the organization of COP25, it was very ad hoc. Our scientific committee was working for the COP25, now it's working on climate change, and we've been exploring more and extending more our role of the scientific exploration, especially because the 200 recommendations that the scientists gave to us in COP25 has given us an agenda of joint collaboration with the Ministry of Environment, with the Ministry of Energy, with the Ministry of Public Works, of Public Affairs, of Foreign Affairs as well, because we're also working with COP25, 26. So the opportunity that we see today, thinking about all this scientific advice, it's not just a direct work agenda for each sector, but as Gavin said, we also have to be focused on very complex problems. So the agenda is multi-sectorial, it's not just on one aspect. And as a Ministry of Science, it opens a new line of work for us, which is not just defining a public policy on science, but we have to have an agenda on how science can impact public policy in other ministries. And this is fundamental. It's been one of our most fundamental findings and learnings, and as a ministry, I totally agree with many of the things that were mentioned in the panel, and it's got related to all the learnings that we've had as a ministry. For example, at the beginning of our process, we had to understand really what was public policy, what do we do with this ocean of evidence that is generated locally and internationally? How do we do this? And that was our first challenge, was how do we clearly define? And this is not an automatic process. This takes a lot of time of interacting with other ministries to be able to determine the question. It's like when you're developing research, you have to take time to develop your question. And when we're talking about how we relate scientific advice to public policy, what's the question? It's taking a long time. What is the public problem that we have to formulate? And the second finding for us was that if the scientific community isn't clear about the impact that it needs to generate, it has to know. So in that sense, evidence needs to be synthesized, summarized. That's really important. So we've learned that the discussions that the intergovernmental panel on climate change and all the evidence that we have on climate change, and that are a basis for implementing actions in a global context, it's really important. But we have to be able to translate that challenge to our own context, our own local context, because the challenges and the impacts are very different in our local context. So when we have a synthesis of evidence, when we contextualize the evidence, or a fifth element, very relevant element, is to be able to develop capacities to translate and communicate this evidence, because oftentimes the scientific community says, oh, we've got the evidence, and we want it to automatically be translated into a political
public policy, but it's not, the policymaker isn't just thinking about the evidence, they're thinking about many other dimensions: legal, economical, technological, societal, ethical. So that comprehension, that understanding, it's very, very clear in the report, of course, because we talked about this. You know, we think that this analysis that has been made in the report talks about this very clearly. And together with this, to know how to communicate evidence gets us much nearer to this set of recommendations that we would like to give to the people that take decisions. And so we've seen from very near in the climate change committee, for example, in the green operation, they find a set of evidence, but the way in which the recommendations are constructed, it has to be in the language of the decision makers, right? So we have to communicate from the scientific advisor to the policymaker. We have to learn to use the proper language, because if in Chile we want to build a process that has a real impact, we have to do this. We have been able to generate some capacities. We have an experience that isn't as systemic as in the United Kingdom. So that's why we're so happy to have this report, because once we're looking at this experience that's being systematized in this report, we can actually understand the system, which we didn't have, of course. So this has allowed us to create new capacities, capabilities, which inspires us to get these new realities and also to deepen these new capacities. But it's good news for us. It's good to know that there's a lot of work to do still, but it's also a huge challenge for us how to generate those alliances and those agreements to be able to advance. And I don't want to speak too much, but there's some really fundamental things that I would like to mention from my own comprehension of the report and this discussion that we've had during all these months. For example, the importance that I can see in the case of the United Kingdom, where we could see that the departments have to declare the areas of scientific interest. Or if we say in our own context, how we identify from the public sector the needs that we have to incorporate knowledge into decision-making processes. And it's something that we haven't been able to visualize very well. So for us, it's a very good opportunity, especially in COVID. I've seen these processes and all these responses that have been generated, but this need of having knowledge and to connect all this knowledge that is in other sectors, for example, in the universities or in the intermediaries, for example, this network, for example, this what work centers that you have, or the ONGs or the industry, that usually when that area of scientific interest is declared, then there is a way of communicating this knowledge. So we see that there's a starting point there in terms of actually giving that clue, giving that cue of how to connect knowledge and how to facilitate this knowledge brokering between the different actors. And finally, we have all these lessons learned. Carol, thank you for having deepened all these aspects in the panel, because when you're looking at it from a systematic or from a systemic point of view, in the end, they're like principles that you have to consider if you want to implement a structure of scientific advice. So you can't forget about equity, diversity, inclusion, the different disciplines that need to be integrated, because the problems that we face from the public sector are very complex. So we can't just resolve it from one perspective. It's a very limited and restricted and incomplete vision. So that richness that we have gained from this panel is a real lesson for us. And another element is the data. Pandemia showed that data is fundamental, especially in the Chilean case. We've seen this, and we implemented We started with a very small set of data that was incomplete, imperfect. And as we have advanced, we have a much more robust database, and it's been constantly strengthening with data from COVID. And in climate change, we've also been advancing in scientific advice, but also we realized if we wanted to have better available evidence, we needed to strengthen our database. So I would say that database is so important to strengthen advice. Otherwise, we just have declarations, but we don't have sufficient elements to be able to connect with the needs that we need to confront. So this is a process that is not easy. It's dynamic because systems evolve, as we've seen in the report, 70 years of evolution. And it starts with one of the first declarations of the report is, once the report has been written, it will probably need updating because there are continuous changes. And we've realized this, that from the moment that we started the ministry in 2018, with all the internal processes and global processes that we've lived, our ministry has also changed radically. And that's a huge challenge in terms of how we have to connect the way that we feedback, the way that we think in the academia, and also the way that people think in the public sector. And these are two systems that are very, very complex, and that's a huge potential. If they can interconnect appropriately, they can really be a huge contribution to the different issues that we have to face. And we're going for sustainable development, and that is important for this. So I would like to thank Daniela and the embassy for this great connection that we started, and with the COP in 2019, and which we're seeing today materialized in this panel. And thank you for all the work that's been done, all the efforts, and also Gavin for always being so available for all the questions we have, and we have even more questions. I'm sure I'm going to send you a list of questions soon. And also Carol and all our panelists, Seremi as well, thank you very much for being here, because our intention is that we're starting a process, and that we hope that it's going to be stronger and stronger. Thank you very much for everything.
So well, I hope you enjoyed this event as much as we did. I'm sorry for running late, but the conversation was so good that we didn't want to cut it out. As we promised, the report is now available in English and in Spanish in the website that it should be being displayed on the screen, and whose link is being shared in the chat. Thank you all for making the time in your busy schedules to join us. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you all a pleasant day. Please feel free to reach us to do more conversations. We, as an embassy, we will be really happy to continue this journey that's only starting. And in the report, you will see many answers to your questions. So I think I'll be sharing, I hope, the link right now. Yeah, have a good day, everyone. Thank you.